Hello there, freaky friends. It is me, your spooky girl, Kate, and welcome to episode number 8 of the Bone Garden podcast. If you've listened to the show before, welcome back. If you're new here, hi, nice to meet me. My name is Kate. I'm a lifelong true crime and paranormal enthusiast, and I'm on a journey to learn about all sorts of creepy, freaky stuff. I don't have any housekeeping for the show this week, but I do just very quickly want to jump on the bandwagon regarding something that I didn't think that I would like, and it literally consumed the past 12 hours of my life. So, recently, and by recently, I mean a couple of days ago, Netflix released a new series that was called Monster: The Jeffrey Dahmer Story, and it starred Evan Peters playing Jeffrey Dahmer. There's an incredible ensemble cast who are just, we'll get into it here in a second. I am always very apprehensive whenever a movie or a series comes out regarding anything true crime. It's very easy for the writers to just glaze over what actually happened and take a lot of creative liberties that take away from the victims, that take away from the case. That was not the case with Monster. This is obviously not sponsored by Netflix whatsoever. I have studied Jeffrey Dahmer for a very long time. Way back before I even decided that I wanted to do a podcast, I remember sitting down and watching Jeffrey Dahmer's actual interview, and it was a couple of hours, but I couldn't look away. And after I'd watched that interview, I was like, there's nothing regarding Dahmer is going to top hearing Dahmer's story from his own mouth. Then I was proved wrong. Evan Peters, I've got a lot of opinions about him. None of them are negative. Zero. Evan Peters is probably one of, if not the most talented actor in the industry right now. And you can definitely tell watching the show, even just the pilot in the first, if you're on the fence about the show, give it 10 minutes of your time. And I promise you, you won't be disappointed. Peters completely sucked me into this show. And I don't want to just say that it's Evan Peters doing. The writers of this show were so incredibly accurate that Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment in this show, is an exact fucking replica of Dahmer's actual apartment. So, Monster: The Jeffrey Dahmer Story, well, it follows Jeff's life. It follows his process of taking victims, brutalizing them, disposing of the bodies, and eventually in the show, just like in real life, Dahmer gets caught and everything goes to trial. There is a part of the trial where they were giving out victim impact statements, and I was watching it with bated breath because I didn't know, again, if the writers were going to take creative liberties, if they were going to glaze over what the families of the victims actually said, kind of in an attempt to give a more shock value statement to make things more theatrical. I watched the scene with the victim impact statements, and then I went and I cross-referenced it with the actual victim impact statements from the tapes of Jeffrey Dahmer's actual trial. And they didn't skip a goddamn thing. In fact, the writers of this show were so in depth that one of the mothers of the victims, the actress that was portraying her, was wearing an identical fucking necklace. The writers of this show got things down to the necklace that somebody was wearing, to the outfits, to the hair, to the mannerisms, the speech patterns. Jeffrey Dahmer, played by Evan Peters, I felt like I was looking at the real guy. Admittedly, there are some portions of the show where you can tell that there is a contrast from the actual case. For instance, in the Netflix show, they don't really show Jeffrey killing most of his victims. I believe that they only showed the actual murder of, I believe it was one person. Also, in the show, when they go over Conorak, he is the 14-year-old Laotian boy that Jeffrey Dahmer killed. They don't really explain in detail until the end of the show why Conorak was acting the way that he was. And that was because Jeffrey Dahmer had drilled a hole into his head and had been experimenting with a mix of acid and boiling water. I understand that Netflix, they have a line that they can't really cross. And unfortunately, with the case as absolutely disgusting and horrifying as Jeffrey Dahmer's, they couldn't show everything. Going into the show initially, I'd understood that. And there are also some things that were addressed in the show where I was like, I don't know if that's true. Most of that being Jeffrey Dahmer's relationship with his father. There is so much to Jeffrey Dahmer's case that I honestly can't cover in this intro. If you were ever wondering if I have plans to cover Jeffrey Dahmer, the answer is absolutely motherfucking yes. Won't be anytime soon, but I definitely want to cover this case because it is horrible and it needs to be talked about. And I know that the spotlight really is on Jeffrey Dahmer and Evan Peters at the moment. But, being able to talk about the victims, understanding their legacy, where they came from, what happened to them, it's very important to a lot of people and it's very important to me. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents on Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story on Netflix. 1 billion out of 10, I recommend it. Go check it out if you want to. But without any further ado, we are going to be hopping straight into this week's episode. And we are going to be covering something that I promised myself I would never fucking cover. But I asked some of you on social media, and I even asked my friend group what they wanted me to cover. And if you're my friend and you're listening to this, how fucking dare you? You just want to torture me. In this week's episode, we are going to be covering one of the most notoriously haunted objects in the entire fucking world. Now, when you think of your favorite childhood toy, what comes to mind? For me, it was always a stuffed dog that I carried around everywhere until I was about 10 years old. But for you, maybe it's like an action figure or a teddy bear or even like a security blanket. But for one boy in Key West, Florida, his favorite childhood toy became his best friend. It became his only friend. But what if your best friend, what if your favorite childhood toy was the very cause of your death? What if your favorite childhood toy was actually a vessel for inhuman spirits? This week's episode, we are going to be tackling the horrifying, mind-blowing case of Robert the Doll. Now, we're going to be taking a slightly different approach to this week's episode. Normally, when I cover a case, I write out all my notes, and I use them as a pushing off point. But we're going to be covering things a little bit more of like a campfire story style. So, grab your teddy bear, flip on your nightlight, and strap in, because here we go. In order to understand Robert the Doll, you first have to understand Robert the Boy. Robert Eugene Otto was born October 25th, 1900, to his parents Thomas and Minnie Otto. Robert was one of 4 children. He had one sister named Mizpah, who was born in 1892, an older brother named Joseph, born in 1895, and one other older brother named Thomas Jr., who was born in 1897. Dr. Thomas Osgood Otto, Robert's father, was a 3rd-generation doctor, and while Dr. Otto spent a lot of his free time donating to charities and doing volunteer work, his wife Minnie stayed at home with the children. The Otto family lived in a Queen Anne Victorian-style mansion that was located at 534 Eaton Street in Key West, Florida. The Otto estate, which was later renamed the Artist House, spanned almost 3,500 square feet over 3 floors, with 7 bedrooms, multiple bathrooms, and a turret room. Because the home was so large, the Otto family employed a number of servants, including a nursemaid who served as a nanny for the young children. Because of Minnie's heritage as a Bahamian American woman, she decided to employ young women from the Bahamas to work for the Ottos. One particular housekeeper became a cornerstone of the Otto household. She was a young woman who was hired to be a nursemaid for the children. She would essentially act as a nanny, caring for the children, tending to them, and essentially acting as a third parent. However, with Robert being the baby of the family, most of the nursemaid's attention gravitated toward him. This nursemaid absolutely adored Robert, and he very quickly became the apple of her eye. So it seemed that life in the Otto household was absolutely perfect. There were no indications or records of abuse, assault, or anything shady. So the children were happy. The nursemaids were happy. Everything was perfect. Until Robert's 4th birthday. This is where Robert the doll's origin becomes a little bit messy. There are 2 theories as to how Robert got the doll, so we'll go over them both. The first theory is that the Bahamian housemaid handcrafted the doll for Robert. The maid had stuffed and stitched the doll especially for him, and even used an old sailor's outfit that Robert had outgrown in the years prior. The Otto family wasn't very religious, and one day Minnie Otto had caught the maids practicing black magic and fired them all, except for the one nursemaid who had taken care of the children all those years. The same maid who actually made the doll. The nursemaid was furious that Mrs. Otto was so cavalier about firing her entire staff, so the nursemaid put a curse on Robert the doll, imbuing him with dark energy. The second theory, which is the most common version of Robert's origins, is that Robert's grandfather, Dr. Joseph Otto, took a trip to Germany in 1904 to visit some family members. While he was there, he had a custom doll made for Jean. The doll was manufactured by the Steiff Company, a toy company in Giggling, Germany. The doll was originally designed to be a clown. However, upon Dr. Joseph Otto's request, the manufacturer stripped off the clown paint and, in the process of modifying him to look like a sailor, a variety of nicks and cuts were left on the doll's face. As a matter of fact, the person who helped design Robert the doll, a man named Richard Steiff, also helped to design the first teddy bear, which was showcased on February 15, 1903. Regardless of which theory you believe, as we know him now, Robert the doll is about 40 inches tall and is stuffed with excelsior, a type of wool that is made from finely shaved wooden fibers. Robert wears a sailor uniform, complete with a little hat, and he has an animal companion that resembles a lion. When young Robert Eugene Otto first met the doll, he fell head over heels in love with it. Up until Robert had received the doll, he had actually gone by his first name. However, he decided to give the doll his first name instead, and insisted on going by his middle name for essentially the rest of his life. So, the doll became Robert, and Robert Eugene Otto became Eugene, or Gene for short. Robert the doll began accompanying Gene everywhere that he went. Gene constantly played with and talked to Robert, and Gene's parents were so glad that Gene had finally found a friend that he could relate to and that brought him so much genuine happiness. Mr. and Mrs. Otto were so happy, in fact, that they decided to convert one of the rooms in the house, known nowadays as the turret room, into Robert's own bedroom. The turret room is a spire-like room in the house that is accessible by taking a winding staircase up a couple of flights of stairs. Robert's room was filled with toys, books, and games for Robert and Jean to enjoy. Everything was wonderful at first. One day, one of Jean's parents overheard Jean talking to Robert, asking him questions and laughing with him. They didn't think much of it until they heard giggling. Giggling that didn't sound like their son. Giggling that turned into laughter, that turned into whispers, that turned into human speech. Speech that didn't sound like their son. The voice was off. It didn't sound like something that their young son could have produced, even if he was pretending to be somebody else. Jean's parents barged in, expecting to see another person in the room, maybe even a home intruder, but it was just Jean and Robert. From there, things began to get stranger. Furniture began moving and vanishing. A chair from the kitchen might have ended up in the living room. Cabinets were thrown open in the pantries. Items were tossed around the house. It looked like somebody had broken into the home, but when his parents asked him what had happened, Jean replied, "Robert did it." Of course, Jean's parents didn't believe him, but Jean was adamant that Robert could move on his own. He would walk around. He would talk and whisper and laugh with Jean. He would climb into bed with him. He would whisper him secrets. As far as Jean was concerned, Robert acted like a real person. It isn't uncommon for young children to have imaginary friends. In fact, an estimated 65% of children develop an imaginary friend by the age of 7. Even I had an imaginary friend when I was growing up, and I'm sure that a lot of you did too. But then again, I also used to pretend that I was a ninja and that I could knock a tree over with a single punch. But I knew well enough that it was all pretend. It was make-believe. But Jean? Who knows? One of the most famous incidents regarding Robert and Jean happened when Jean was about 10 years old. Mrs. Otto woke up in the dead of night and heard Jean screaming from his room. Personally, I'm an aunt to an 8-month-old and a 6-year-old, and I've heard when my nephew has woken up from a bad dream. I've heard him scream and cry before, and it's heartbreaking, but I could tell just from the sound that it was just a nightmare. It was a dream, and nothing more. However, what Mrs. Otto heard that night didn't sound like her son had woken up from a bad dream. It sounded like he was being brutally attacked. Mrs. Otto ran down the hall, pounding on the door and telling Jean to open it. But for the first time, Jean's door was locked. Mrs. Otto panicked and insisted that he open the door while all the commotion was happening. When the door was finally unlocked, Mrs. Otto threw it open and saw that the entire bedroom had been absolutely ransacked. Furniture, toys, and books were thrown everywhere. Jean was huddled on his bed, absolutely terrified. Sitting in front of him, staring at him with beady eyes, was Robert. When Jean could finally muster the words to tell his mother what happened, his story was unreal. He woke up in the middle of the night and saw Robert sitting at the edge of his bed staring at him. Then, suddenly, everything in the room began to levitate and fly around in the air. Books were pulled from the shelves. Toys and stuffed animals were lifted off of the floor. The blankets on Jean's bed flew off of his mattress as if something grabbed them and ripped them off with incredible force. As if things couldn't possibly get worse after what Mrs. Otto saw, things did. They got worse very quickly. Allegedly, Robert began moving around the house on his own. He would disappear from his room in the turret and then appear in the bathroom, or the living room, or the kitchen. Jean's family began hearing giggling and laughter in the dead of night. Neighbors would confront the family, telling them to stop leaving their doll in the window. Another famous occurrence was when the Ottos had a plumber over to fix some pipes. While he was working, the plumber began to hear distant laughing. He would hear indiscernible whispers, chatter, knocking, tapping, and doors opening. When the plumber called out to whoever was in the house, he didn't get a response. Nobody was home, as the Ottos had gone out and left the plumber alone to do his work. Even though the family was terrified of Robert, Jean still adored him. One day, Jean's aunt visited the Otto home and immediately knew that something was horribly wrong. She told his parents that the doll and Jean were possessed. His parents were upset, but not surprised because of what had transpired. The family knew that they had to do something, but they were terrified of burning the doll and releasing the spirit from its physical husk. So Jean's aunt, along with his parents, locked Robert away in the turret room. The next day, Jean's aunt tragically died. Her death is still a mystery to this very day, but chances are that it'll go unsolved. The details behind her tragic passing will fade. People will forget. The secrets behind her tragic death will be locked away, just like Robert. A few years after his aunt's death, Jean's father, Thomas Osgood Otto, died on March 31st, 1917, at 52 years old, in the Otto household. Thomas Osgood Otto was buried in the Key West Cemetery. The inscription on his headstone reads, Thomas Osgood Otto, January 11th, 1865, to March 29th, 1917. Husband of Minnie Elizabeth Otto, father of Mizpah, Joseph, Thomas Jr., and Eugene. He held the world in his heart in love and charity. A couple of months after their father's death, Jean's brothers were drafted by the U.S. military to serve during World War I. Fortunately, both of the brothers would survive the war. Thomas Jr. would go on to live until 1962, and Joseph would live until 1981. Even amidst the chaos being orchestrated by Robert, Jean aspired to become an artist. When he wasn't playing with toys or reading books, Jean found himself in front of an easel, painting whatever came to mind. Whatever thought, whatever feeling, Jean wanted to release it onto canvas. Jean attended a variety of art schools in his early adulthood, including the Academy of Fine Arts in Chicago, before traveling to Paris in the mid-1920s. While he was in Paris, he met Annette Parker, also known as Anne. Anne was a bright, cunning woman with an infectious smile and bubbly personality. By pure coincidence, Anne was from the East Coast of the United States as well, but she was traveling as a professional pianist. Anne specialized in jazz music. When Jean returned home, he spent a great deal of time living with his sister Mizpah and her husband, Dr. Michael DeBow. Now 29 years old, Jean filled his free time by working as a middleman for the buying and selling of art pieces in Florida. Jean adored his career. It was an opportunity for him to get his foot in the door of the cutthroat art industry. However, Jean knew that something was missing from his life. A note, a melody, a missing piece. That missing piece was Annette Parker. Jean returned to Paris to reunite with Anne, and the pair fell in love. After their honeymoon, Jean and Annette moved to New York City for a while. Jean continued to pursue his career as an artist while Annette performed in local theaters and jazz clubs. So we have the tale of an aspiring painter with stars in his eyes and a musician who seems to be drawing attention in all the right ways. Everything is perfect. Serene. Robert the Doll is finally at peace, having protected his best friend and knowing that he was flourishing. He spent the rest of his days in the turret room where he was eventually discovered by a museum curator who offered to take him in. Robert is now happy. He's in a museum and everything is wonderful. And they all lived happily ever after. The end. I'm just kidding. This wouldn't be on the Bone Garden podcast if it had a happy ending. In 1945, Jean and his siblings are contacted by their uncle and they are urged to return home. 534 Eaton Street, Key West, Florida. The place where it all began. Minnie Otto, now 77 years old, was gravely ill. She'd been left alone in the Otto home for years. Just her and Robert. On September 14th, 1945, surrounded by her loved ones, Minnie Elizabeth Watkins Otto passed away. She was buried near her husband in the Key West Cemetery. Her headstone read, Minnie Elizabeth Otto, wife of Thomas Osgood Otto, mother of Mizpah, Joseph, Thomas Jr., and Eugene. Her life was a beautiful morning. Now that both of their parents had passed away, the Otto children were left with an enormous feat. figuring out what to do with the sprawling family mansion. As well off as his siblings were, none of them stepped forward to claim the home. So Jean and Annette saw an opportunity, and they moved into the Otto family home, aptly renaming it the Artist House. As Jean and his bride settled into their new home, you can't help but wonder what the atmosphere in the Artist House felt like. Was the home bright like a new dawn, or dark like a bad memory? After unpacking their belongings, Jean roamed the house, reliving all of the years that he had spent there. The balmy afternoons with the windows open, letting the salty sea air into the halls. Playing with his siblings. Laughing with his nanny. And then, Robert. After all of those years, Minnie Otto had left Robert locked in his room up in the turret. Maybe he'd let himself out of his prison while Jean was away, or perhaps he had stayed put, content in his body. Or maybe, just maybe, he was lying dormant, hibernating, waiting for his best friend to come home. Either way, when 45-year-old Jean Otto stepped into Robert's room and laid eyes on his childhood companion, he was overjoyed. He had his toy back. He had his best friend back. After years of traveling abroad and living in New York, the pair was reunited. Jean picked up almost exactly where he had left off with Robert. He would bring Robert all over the home. Anywhere that Jean went, Robert was sure to follow. They would play games together. They would talk to each other. And Jean would even put Robert in his favorite spot, perched on the sill of one of the many windows in the turret room. Robert continued to move around the house of his own volition, climbing down the steps leading to his room and perching himself in various windows throughout the home. Jean later converted Robert's bedroom into an art studio where he would spend hours and days on end painting and creating masterpieces, with Robert by his side. And of course, as any good friend would do, Jean was more than willing to make accommodations for Robert. Jean carried a rocking chair up the steps to the turret room and put it in front of a window so that Robert would have somewhere comfortable to sit. Robert would spend days looking out over the Key West neighborhood as his best friend worked. Although Jean was ecstatic to have Robert with him again, the doll's presence caused an enormous strain on Jean and Annette's marriage. Annette had never wanted to move to Florida. She thrived in New York City, having spent years making a name for herself in the Big Apple. But she had compromised and moved to Florida with her husband because he had wanted to keep the Otto estate in the family. Anne had tried her best to enjoy her new life, but things just didn't seem right to her. Just like his parents did when he was a child, Anne grew concerned for Jean's well-being. He spent enormous amounts of time locked away in the turret room with Robert, and she often heard her husband laughing and talking to him. Marriage is all about compromises, sure, but when do compromises become sacrifices? And when does love become an obsession? Anne began hearing Jean talk to Robert in the middle of the night. Fragments of conversations. Jean would speak, and after a moment, he would speak again. Giggles. Laughter. A guttural voice that didn't sound like her husband. Now, it's easy enough to push something out of your mind when it's happening down the street or across the country, but this was happening in Anne's house. Then, it was happening in her bedroom, because Jean began perching Robert on the windowsill or on top of one of the dressers in the room that he had shared with his wife. People that visited the artist house would often complain to Anne or Jean that they hated Robert. They wondered why a child's doll, had to be present for parties or for gatherings. One guest ran up to the Ottos, absolutely terrified, because they had sworn that Robert had moved. His hand was at a different angle, or his head was tilted, or he had completely moved to a different position. Anybody that set foot in the artist house could feel a dark magnetism to Robert. Eventually, the strange occurrences took a toll on Annette, who demanded that Robert was locked away in the attic. Jean retaliated, begging his wife to let him keep Robert in the turret room. It was his favorite place. He was the happiest there. Robert wouldn't spend another night in Jean and Annette's bedroom. He would spend his time in his favorite place in the home. After what felt like an eternity of arguing, Annette was defeated. She agreed that yes, Robert could be kept in the turret room. Annette's outburst over Robert didn't deter Jean, though. In fact, he began spending even more time with Robert. Days turned into weeks, and Jean would only leave the turret room for food or to use the bathroom. Weeks turned into months. All Jean could think about was spending time with his friend, his childhood toy, his comfort, his rock. In a world where the universe is limitless, Robert Eugene Otto's universe was 40 inches tall. On June 24th, 1974, the dead body of Robert Eugene Otto was found lying on the hardwood floor of the turret room, with his best friend, Robert, by his side. After his death, Jean's personal effects were distributed to his sister Mizpah and his wife Annette. Mizpah received everything, well, almost everything. The only two items that were left to Annette were the artist house and Robert. Anne tried her best to carry on without her husband, but the strange events occurring in the house continued. Eventually, Anne was pushed to her breaking point. She took Robert out of the turret room and threw him into the attic. Annette began struggling severely after Jean's death and would go on to sell the artist house to a woman named Myrtle Reuter toward the end of 1974. Annette sold the artist house for a mere $50,000. Annette Parker would go on to live the rest of her life, free of Robert, for less than 5 years. In January of 1979, Annette Parker died at 76 years old. When Myrtle Reuter first set foot in the home, she fell in love. After all, she'd purchased the artist house for a price that was too good to be true. She settled into her new home, and later, as she was cleaning and organizing, she found a doll in the attic. 40 inches tall, dressed in an adorable sailor's outfit. She fell in love with the doll, and she took it out of the attic. The two coexisted for a while, until furniture began to move. Doors began opening on their own. There was knocking, tapping, and giggling that filled the air. Myrtle sold the artist house in 1980, but she kept her new companion Robert for 20 years. She did her best to ignore the strange happenings that seemed to follow the doll, but Myrtle's breaking point was when she was suddenly shoved into a closet by an unseen force. After decades of having Robert the doll in her possession, Myrtle Reuter had had enough. She donated Robert the doll to a local museum. Robert the doll is currently on display in a locked plexiglass case in the Fort East Martello Museum, located at 3501 South Roosevelt Boulevard in Key West, Florida. According to psychic mediums, Robert the doll is possessed by several entities, including the spirit of a little girl, as well as the spirit of a servant who had died on the property, and several dark, inhuman entities. Thousands of people make the journey every year to see Robert in person, and are greeted with strange occurrences and rules to follow. Rules for interacting with Robert include: number 1, greet Robert when you walk into the room and introduce yourself to him. Number 2, do not mock Robert's appearance or the appearance of his stuffed lion. Number 3, do not mock the letters that were written to him. Number 4, ask permission to take photographs. And lastly, number 5, thank Robert after taking a photograph of him, and thank him when you leave. Severe misfortunes come to anybody who breaks the rules for interacting with Robert. People have lost their jobs. Their marriages have fallen apart. They lose everything that they have. One story tells of a man who had come to visit Robert and left after taking a picture without his permission. On his way home, the man's motorcycle was hit by an oncoming vehicle and he died at the scene. The museum receives near constant flows of letters and emails from patrons, begging for Robert's forgiveness. These letters are allegedly read aloud to Robert by staff or are hung up around his display case. The artist house still stands to this day and serves as a popular bed and breakfast location. While staying in the house, people have reported hearing doors open and slam shut, as well as knocking, tapping, whispering, and laughter. People also experience feelings of dizziness, nausea, headaches, muscle pains, and vivid nightmares. Some of the letters that have been written to Robert over the years include the following. Dear Robert, I went to Key West in October of 2009. I decided to come see you. I was told to ask you before I took any pictures of you. I asked to take your picture 3 times, and all 3 times my camera shut off. It was a new camera and had new batteries, so I know that it wasn't the camera's fault. I turned around to take a picture of the hearse behind me and had no more issues with the camera. When I got home, I downloaded the pictures onto my computer and realized that your reflection was in the glass on the hearse. I didn't really think anything of it. Shortly after, my computer crashed with a virus. I got injured at work. I lost my job. I lost my truck. And I lost my home. It has been a downhill slide since then. If I didn't believe before, I do now. I apologize if I upset you. Sincerely, Joanne. Dear Robert, my girlfriend and I visited you on the morning of March 2nd, 2009. When we passed you by, I made the comment that you were creepy and stated that I wasn't superstitious about old stories like yours. That very same night, I lost my wallet containing $240 in cash. I also lost both my girlfriend's and my driver's license, as well as a credit card and ATM card. Trying to fly home the next day without our IDs was next to impossible. Today was my first day back at work since arriving home. Without going into details, I've had one problem after another. We also found out that whoever found or stole my wallet charged $143 worth of drinks to our credit card before we were able to close the account. I would like to take this opportunity to apologize to you for calling you names and for not believing your ability to bring mischief into my life. I am truly sorry, Robert, and I hope that we can make amends after you read my apology. You are a fellow that demands respect. I look forward to visiting you on my next trip down to the Keys. Sincerely, Mike and Virginia. Dear Robert, you have probably received many letters like this from people like me. People who were sure that there was no such thing as a Robert the Doll curse. You see, it's easy to act tough and try to impress your friends by being disrespectful. And unfortunately, that is the camp that I find myself in. My name is Dan. Back in 2009, we visited the East Martell Museum, and the entire purpose of the visit was to come and meet you. We had walked by your old house multiple times over the years, and we've always wanted to come see you at the museum. Our visit was fun and informative, and seeing you was the best part. I'm not sure what made me act like a jerk to you. I didn't ask for your permission to take your picture, and I openly mocked you. Like I said, I was just trying to be funny and impress the people that I was visiting you with. I, in no way, meant what I said, and I realize now that I made a huge mistake. Since that day in late 2009, we have had a run of bad luck. I've had multiple health issues, I had a near-death experience with anemia, and we had family members and pets die. We've also had bad luck with our finances that ended with us filing for bankruptcy and still having financial difficulties to this day. The purpose of this letter is to profoundly apologize and ask for your forgiveness. Thank you, Dan. Dear Robert, I am very sorry for not asking your permission to take your picture while I was visiting the museum last week. Since I have taken your picture without permission, many strange things have happened to me. While driving back from the Keys, a deer ran out in front of our car. We had to swerve to avoid hitting it, and we ran off the road, nearly hitting a tree. 2 days later, we had a small kitchen fire. Also, we have been hearing childlike giggling coming from our basement. Last night, I was home all alone. I heard a voice coming from the basement. When I went to investigate, I tripped and fell down the stairs. I got up to run out, but the door was locked. My husband said that I probably turned the lock myself without thinking about it. But honestly, Robert, we both know the truth. Please accept my deepest apologies for taking your picture without asking. Also, please accept my daughter's apology for sticking her tongue out at you and making fun of you. Sincerely, Rosie. So is Robert the Doll truly one of the most notoriously haunted objects in the world? Or is he just a local legend? Well, find out for yourself. Walk the halls of the artist house and spend the night in the turret room suite. Or, if you dare, visit the East Martello Museum in Key West, Florida, and take a photo of Robert. Just remember to mind your manners, or Robert the Doll might just ruin your life. Well, we got through it. Thank you, all you wonderful guys, gals, non-binary pals, for tuning in this week and listening to the story of Robert the Doll. You know, this wasn't as scary as I thought it was going to be, so look at us conquering our fears together. Pediophobia, who? We don't know her. So I figured that I would actually write my own letter to Robert. And I was going to do this after recording, but I think I'm just going to do it now with you guys. So we are going to write, Dear Robert, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to cover your story on my podcast. I'd also like to thank you for giving my listeners the opportunity to learn your story and legacy. I recognize your proclivity for mischief and appreciate your power. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to visit you in the future. Please take care. Much love from Massachusetts. Kate from TBG for the Bone Garden. And I'm going to actually submit that online because there is an option for you to write letters to Robert on the website. And that website, I just had to double check, it is called robertthedoll.org. And it'll give you options like home, visit, connect. You're going to click on connect, and you can actually fill out a little letter for Robert and, let him know how your visit was. If you visited him, you can just send him a little letter to say hi. But I'm going to submit that now. You are more than welcome to do the same yourself. And again, if you wanted to go and actually visit Robert the Doll, that address was 3501 South Roosevelt Boulevard in Key West, Florida. Zip code is 33040. Just make sure if you go visit him, you are polite and respectful and ask permission, okay? I don't want you giving me a 1-star rating because you took a picture of Robert and now your car is broken down. So, I sincerely hope that you all enjoyed this episode. I actually had a lot of fun researching and recording. As always, I'd like to give a gigantic thank you to my best friend, Pippin. Pippin is the digital artist that did the cover of my podcast. If you or anybody that you know is looking to get some artwork done, please feel free to go reach out to them on Twitter. Their Twitter handle is at ARCHERKASAI. And if you have any recommendations for future topics or you just want to say hi to me, all of my social media information is in the show notes below. I am working on my YouTube channel so that way I can upload the episodes from Apple Podcast, get them up on YouTube so that more people can listen to it. So if you have any friends that just don't have an iPhone or an iPad or an whatever, you can give them my YouTube information. I always interact with people that comment on the YouTube videos. I always interact with people that tweet at me, that email me, that comment on the Facebook posts. So please don't be shy. I don't bite, I promise. All right, well, I'm going to go watch some cute videos of animals. Just make sure that you guys, gals, non-binary pals, beautiful, handsome, amazing people, Stay safe, be kind to each other, and stay the fuck away from Robert the doll. Bye, guys!